guys, welcome to another BigLipz podcast. As always, my name is Catherine Reese, joined by my good friend Sam Macaulay-Blair. For those who don't know, obviously the BigLipz podcast, we are two kind of independent filmmakers. Last season and last year we spoke specifically about film and movies. This year we've changed that up to talk about TV shows. And we tend to split it up into, we take turns hosting one each month. So one week we'll do either content or concept, and then we'll swap it the next week. So obviously last week we did the kind of concept of horror TV, and for once I've chosen a thematically linked content episode. So for this episode, which is episode 18, we are going to be talking about the Midnight Club, which is something we mentioned very briefly last time. So for those who don't know, it's another Mike Flanagan horror TV show. It's one, as I say, we didn't really discuss last time for obvious reasons. So yeah, to just jump right in, Sam, did you have any knowledge of the show before we watched it, or what kind of were your expectations going in?
They're all, like, every show, I think that every series that Mike Flanagan's done since Hill House has been on my radar in like some degree. Even though I haven't seen Hill House. But I think just because of like the profile of Hill House, it's just, again, like I've mentioned this like a lot of times before, but I generally keep my ear to the ground regarding like films and shows and video games and just like news and stuff like that. I enjoyed like just the sort of the trivia of it, and just like knowing what things are coming out and upcoming, and it's nice to have things to look forward to. It's nice to be like, oh, there's a new show coming, and so as a result, I was aware of like Bly Manor, obviously did watch that. I was aware of Midnight Mass last year, especially because that got a lot of acclaim, and then I remember hearing that Mike Flanagan's new series was going to be the Midnight Club. I think I might have confused it with something else, but like the premise of it was something else, because it kind of was what I thought it was, but wasn't what I thought it was.
Okay.
If that makes any sense. The premise of it is obviously these young people who all have like terminal diagnosis. They go to this hospice, they're in like care, and they form the Midnight Club. I think I thought it was about like disabled people who were also superheroes.
Okay.
but I think that is a book that exists. I'm sure it's called like The Ables, or The Abled, or something like that. And I think it's by the guy that does Cinema Sins.
Oh really?
Yeah. So I think, and that was like, I'm sure he wrote that years ago. So I think that I maybe like scanned something that mentioned the Midnight Club, or read something that mentioned the Midnight Club, and like they maybe like alluded to the premise. Maybe it wasn't known or something, and maybe my brain has just gone like, it's just taken the premise that I'd already heard and just like put it on top of that one. But I had also, like, this was it must have been ages ago, because this was like a distant thing. Because I remember when I started watching the Midnight Club, I was kind of like, I don't really know what this is going to be. Like, I'll just go into it and see what, and then when obviously like the main character develops her, like, well, starts showing her sickness, I was like, so now she's gonna get superpowers.
I can only imagine your confusion. Like, how many episodes in were you when you were finally like, that must have been wrong, I must have misread that?
Well, I was never that convinced of it in the first place. It was kind of just like, it just kind of was like in the back of my head that like that might be, which happens with a lot of things that I watch, where like I don't really know anything about it, but I think either I'm worried that I'd like read or seen something that maybe like gives something away, or my brain just like must just make some like inductive leap at some point where it will just like take, because I know nothing, it will just take something wild, maybe like something from another film or show, or like, again, probably something I've not seen as well, and then just like put that information on top of this information. And
like when I was talking about Bly Manor last time, and I was determined that there was some kind of time travel element.
Exactly. Yeah, I think sometimes our brain just like play up on these things, and I think that's what happened with the Midnight Club. So, luckily, I wasn't like as convinced as you were,
I'm still
but it
disappointed
was.
about that.
Yeah, but there was a little bit of whiplash, just with like everything that was going on, because it was like, I think it was like when it was like a terminal diagnosis, I was like, okay, I guess that is, I mean that kind of is a disability,
Yeah.
but just like, you know, as bad as one can get, but yeah, it just wasn't quite what I expected basically, in that sense. But yeah, I kind of tried to go in as blind as possible, because I'd heard of Mike Flanagan. I'd seen Blind Manor at this point, and I'd had nothing but praise for his works basically. So yeah, I thought I was just on board. I think that maybe was why I had only skimmed the article before, because I was like, I kind of don't want to know. I'll end up watching it at some point, and the less I know, the better.
Yeah.
So yeah, what did you know going
in? So basically, the reason I chose this one, and I'm sure you'll remember, it was very much a snap decision. I was kind of humming and hawing about what I would choose, because I knew I wanted to do horror TV, but I couldn't like decide which one I wanted to go for. And I thought, I'm a big Mike Flanagan fan. Obviously, but at this point you hadn't seen Hill House, which would have been the obvious choice. So I thought, oh, it was. I think when we started watching it had literally only just came out. So I feel like that was like a better choice, maybe because there weren't any like preconceptions about it. Obviously, like for us, I have spoken to you about Hill House, so somewhere going in you would have that kind of in the back of your head. So this was like a nice choice, because it was, neither of us had seen it. It was like untainted and fresh. And saying that, very similar to you, I had just I had no kind of thoughts on what it was about. Generally, I had kind of, because I've seen Mike Flanagan things before, one thing I did think was, oh, I wonder how much of his recurring cast is going to appear, because that seems to very much be a thing that he does. And there was a lot of people, there was a fair amount of cast in this that have been in his other things. But in terms of like specifics, I didn't know anything about the plot, the characters, really anything like that. The one thing I had read about it, and we kind of briefly spoke about this before we watched it, was that the first episode contained something like, I think it was like 20 odd jump scares within the first episode. And I remember reading that and actually being quite nervous, because like we spoke about last time, he's not, like he doesn't really rely on jump scares the way that other horror TV and films do. So there was a little bit of me that was almost panicking, like, oh god, why has he done that? And then obviously when you watch the first episode, it makes sense. It's part of the Midnight Club stories. So yeah, that pretty much the only kind of thought I had going in was a little, like, I was fully on board, like you're saying, excited to watch it, and then once I read that, I was a little bit apprehensive, like, oh god, why is he suddenly gone down the jump scare path? But other than that, I had literally, I mean, my expectations were quite high, but in terms of like knowledge of what was happening, it was very minimal. So kind of on that train, what did you think, having watched him?
I thought it was okay. I thought it was like a very, very like strong okay. I thought like there was some parts of it that were really interesting, but I think for the most part, like, again, like I think that's talking about like what I thought going in. So obviously, like even the confused premise I had, I guess the one thing you would kind of think going in or sort of expect maybe is like, you know, it's probably going to pack like a bit of an emotional punch. Like, just because like if you know if it's, yeah, that's what you would assume. That's why you would assume that someone would tell that story, or take that like basically take that like premise and go that way. As you know, they've got like you know, it's going to be told with a lot of heart, and it's going to be told with it's going to be told with a lot of conviction, and there's going to be like a real point to it, and there was that to a degree. I felt, you know, there was like a sort of nice emotional core to it, but I didn't feel like we got as much. It kind of felt, to be honest, kind of felt like a show with a bit of an identity crisis, more than anything. Like, and it kind of felt, again, it being Mike Flanagan, it felt like the expectation was kind of horror, and that kind of felt like a mistake. Like, it kind of felt like it was doing that just because that's what he does, but that kind of felt at odds with what they were going for, and it just, like, there's a lot to the show and a lot of different things that it does, and it has an interesting sort of formula, but I think it just kind of comes across as a bit muddied, rather than it just didn't have that focus that I kind of felt like it needed, and like by the end as well, it just kind of felt like a bit like okay, so it felt a bit like directionless even at the end. It didn't feel like it was as tidy as it should have been. And it just didn't feel super satisfying. What were your like broad thoughts?
So pretty much same as you. If someone had said how was the Midnight Club, my reaction would be like, it was all right. Like, and that's probably the highest praise I could give it. I feel like a big issue with it was based on a book, and I feel like that book was very, very like, you know, that kind of like young adult genre. And weirdly enough, like this kind of teens with kind of terminal illnesses that meet and then start to like build friendships and fall in love, that's a weirdly like such a theme with like young adult books. Like, I don't know why they're so into that. Maybe
because it justifies the angst?
Maybe very angsty, yeah. Not
because I feel like that's a really sorry to interrupt. I was just gonna say, I feel like it's a really interesting story to tell. Like, it just from like an emotional, from like a character perspective, it's really a really interesting way to go with like a story. But I kind of feel like you need to be someone with a terminal illness telling that story to really like do it justice. And I feel like otherwise it does kind of feel like a little bit exploitative. Just and it did, you know, don't get me wrong, like I do feel like the Midnight Club was quite sensitive again. It could have been, it definitely could have been, like, it could have felt very exploitative, and it didn't really, but it just also didn't feel like it didn't feel like someone was like desperate to tell that story. You know, it didn't feel like someone was like, this is something really close to my heart and I really have to like put this on the screen and get this out, which I think is a shame.
That's really funny that you said that, because I read somewhere that it was like a passion project for Mike Flanagan. Like, apparently he's been trying to get it made for years, but like you're saying, it does make sense because it felt rushed. Like, it felt almost like he hadn't properly thought through what story they were trying to tell, what kind of angle they were going for, even like you were saying, like what kind of genre they wanted. Another issue I had with it was, for me, I felt like the characters were but quite like bland, and I feel like they had this one kind of exaggerated trait that was their whole identity. Like, there was the religious girl who all she spoke about was God, and then there was the girl that lies all the time and everything she says is a lie, and then there was the boy that was a nerd and all he wanted to do was play computer games, and then even like the character of Anya, who arguably the best character, she was so like stereotyped as like this stone cold bitch who like eventually thawed, and which is fine, but it didn't feel like there had been a huge amount of thought put into the characters. None of them particularly had any kind of growth or development. There was elements, obviously, like I feel like a good way to judge characters in TV shows is if you remember their names, and I'm struggling to remember their names. So like, for example, the religious girl, and she has an issue with I don't know anyone's name, it's terrible, with the boy who it turns out he's got AIDS. She's got an issue with him because he's gay, or kind of like an implied issue, but then she has this moment where she realizes that he's a good guy and that they're friends, blah blah blah. So there is like elements of growth, but even in that, it's not very original. And I feel like it wasn't. I don't know about you, but for me, if I didn't have to watch it all for the podcast, I'm not sure if I would have finished it by now. Even saying
Yeah.
that, it took me a while to watch it, even though I knew I had to. Do you know what I mean?
I kind of took I approached it like a shot basically. I was just like, I'm just gonna fire through this thing and like get through it as quickly as possible, because I think I said to you, I think I watched it in like 2 days or something, and
Yeah.
it was easier doing it that way, because like it was almost like more rewarding watching like the amount of episodes I had left decreasing
Yeah.
than like actually like I wasn't like finishing an episode and going, oh, okay, here we go, next episode of the Midnight Club.
Yeah.
And
100%.
like you're saying, it's kind of impressive, like to watch like 10 hours or something and to feel like I know the characters like so poorly, and I feel like I should have a lot more. Like you say, like I really struggled to remember the characters' names. I quickly like read something before, and it mentioned
like the IMDb page, like
well, it mentioned was it Alonka, and I had to
they
Google
also,
who that.
we've spoken about this before, but there was also a lot of names where they're obviously said in an American accent, so I'm like, how are we going to pronounce that?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, but I had to Google who that was, and I was like, oh yeah, that's the main that's the protagonist.
Yeah.
Oh no,
Not
like,
a good sign.
Yeah, you are in trouble when like that's the case, you know. And granted, I finished it like a few weeks ago, but at the same time, like I could tell you more about Bly Manor, and I watched that 2 years ago.
100%.
So like it just it like you say, the characters, and they were quite predictable where they were going to go. Like again, like you say, like it was Anya, the one that we in the chair, and she obviously, you know that she's going to have like she's going to soften. And it kind of felt like the show knew that you knew that, because I think there's like she just kind of softens a couple times, and then they don't really make that big a deal out of it, and it was weird. Like it just the way they did it was kind of odd as well. But yeah, like they definitely, especially with like I think the actual premise of the show, the idea of these like terminally ill people who are in this hospice care, and they tell each other stories, and then that's kind of like A, their way of like connecting with each other, B, their way of like coming to terms with like what's happening to them. I think that's like a really interesting idea. Like it's there's so much there, and even the idea of like the show doing different genres and different episodes, like that's a really good idea as well. But it just felt like the show had like defaulted into this like, well, I'm gonna be a horror show, but then I'm also gonna do these other shows, and that just felt really confused.
Yeah.
Like that just felt like a mistake. Like they should have really either it should have been like I feel like it should have been like a drama sort of first and foremost, then branches off. Like it should have been something a bit more neutral. Horror is quite to go from like the one that's like a sci-fi episode, and to go from like horror to that was just, you then just kind of feel a bit like cheated and a bit bored and a bit like why am I watching this? Like this isn't very scary, you know. Again, we talked about in the last podcast, like horror, it's supposed to draw out a very specific emotion. It'd be the same if you're watching a comedy and it suddenly delves into like the, they just don't have funny episodes. You're expecting a very particular like response from watching something, so when you don't get that response, you're annoyed. Whereas if you're watching like a drama and you have like these other segments that go into other genres, you're kind of like, well, there's still drama going on, there's still stuff happening. You don't really, all you really want from drama is people arguing, so like, or people hiding things. You can do a lot within that like sandbox, but I think it would have been cooler to see it actually commit to each genre for like each episode, and maybe like properly do like, okay, this is gonna be this character, like you say, this is gonna be the nerdy guys episode, so it's gonna have like that's gonna like define the style of the episode, and that would have been a more interesting way to go, rather than it just be like, well, he's gonna tell a nerdy story, so we've ticked the box on the character there.
100%. That kind of obviously leads into the next point, which is like, so basically for people that haven't seen it, like you've said, Sam, they kind of meet at midnight and they tell these stories, but obviously each story is told by a different character, and they've got different kind of like themes and aesthetics and things that at times match the theme of the story. So you've kind of touched on it slightly there, but what, like, overall, what were your thoughts on that kind of that part of the show? Did you think, like, for me, it was probably one of the stronger parts of the show, but at the same time, so basically what I've written in my notes is that it was the show's saving grace and somehow a missed opportunity, which I think is kind of what you were hitting at there as well.
Yeah, I actually, to me, I kind of, like, every time they'd start telling their story, I was kind of like, wanted to just get through that bit. And it just, like, again, is an interesting idea, but I think because of the fact that it, like, it's not really advancing. I know it's supposed to be like revealing character, but it's not really advancing the plot. I think that was my issue with it. Was it was a very obvious like we're going to pause the plot and we're going to just talk at each other for a bit.
Yeah.
And it didn't. I think that's the thing. Like, it just, especially when you're watching like 10 hours or something. Did occur a couple of times. I was like, man, I could just skip through.
Yeah, because if you watched the Midnight Club and missed all of the Midnight Club stories, you'd be fine.
So I was speaking to someone who literally said that. They were like, yeah, I've started skipping like most of their stories because like they probably know the characters as well as we do.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, it just, yeah, like I think right from the start, I mean, like, again, it's a really interesting idea. And there was like some cool stuff in there. Don't get me wrong. Like, it was, again, quite fun for the show to just, again, I think we talked about before about horror shows being at their best when they can like take an idea and kind of like build an episode around that rather than maybe like a whole show, because you can maybe mine more out of it. Kind of didn't feel like they fully did that, but that's obviously, the first episode kind of took the piss out of jump scares with like throwing, literally making a point of like throwing as many in your face as it could. And then you had like, I think maybe the most interesting one for me was the one where it was the girl in the car and she has like two hitchhikers. Just because I was like, it was quite an intrigue. Like, it deliberately sort of had these weird things happening where you're like, what's going on here? Like, how, what is happening? And that to me was kind of like the most, there was like a question that kind of drove that one along. So it felt like I was the most invested in that one. All the rest of them, I think, I mean, I'd struggle to even like tell you what most of them were. I remember the time travel one and the hammer one.
Yeah. The hammer one, it got a lot of screen time.
It got a lot of screen time, yeah, for something that's just like a guy. And like, what was that saying about the guy?
There was some kind of weird family demon that would pass on. I mean, it started in the grandfather and then it passed on to the mum and then it passed on to the boy.
Intergenerational trauma, which is again really interesting idea, but it's an idea that's, funnily enough, is like reoccurred a lot this year in movies. I won't say which movies in case you've not seen them, because like some of them in particular have been like great films. But yeah, it definitely is like quite a prominent theme right now. But yeah, it just felt like tacked on to that rather than actually. Yeah. I don't feel like the character had much going on where that was like well explored. There was the one that like was like a sort of noir thing as well, wasn't there? That was one.
That was very cringe.
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah.
But those are my thoughts. Half baked.
Fair, very fair. I feel like one of my points is pretty much what you were saying. I feel like they should have, if they wanted to commit to like a different style or type of horror, they should have, like you're saying, made kind of like the entire episode like that. And then they could have done, there's just so many different things within horror. If you wanted to go down the horror route that you could do like 80s slasher, Japanese horror, like kind of torture porn type thing. There's so many different avenues that they could have gone down, but it was so like, almost like half-baked, I feel. It was just... I feel like one thing that they could have done that I feel like would have been better or worked better if you wanted to go down the horror route was kind of make it, because if there was points throughout like the story that you liked with the hitchhikers, it turned out to be like, oh, that had actually happened. She was actually in the car. She did try to kill herself, but I feel like had they made all of the stories like that they had actually happened, that would have been much more interesting. And that
Yeah.
if you, I feel like I was saying, I feel like the whole season just wasn't developed enough, in my opinion. So there was like this weird kind of underlying, there is or isn't a cult here, or there was or wasn't a cult thing here in the house that they're in. So I feel like you really could have played on that. You could have had that being more of a thing, more of a divine thing. And then if you wanted to go, because there was weird elements where suddenly Alonka would be in the hallway and it would be like in the past almost,
Yeah.
and she'd be like seeing things like that. That was very
And really like really weirdly done, where it was like really obvious like rear screen sort of projection type thing. Where it, like,
yeah,
but it felt like they were doing that stylistically, but then it was supposed to be really real, and yeah, it just felt really confused. Like that whole like,
yeah.
and it kind of they did it a couple times early on, kind of just dropped it.
100%, yeah. And there was it only seemed to be two characters that were experiencing it, which didn't
Yeah.
make sense. It would have made more sense if either they all experienced it or only one of them did.
Yeah, and they kind of comment on that as well, where they're like, "Well, two of you are experiencing it, so it must be like a shared thing, so it's like a real thing." But yeah, then they're just like, "Yeah, we're just gonna ignore that for the rest of the season."
Yeah, back to the stories.
Yeah.
So I feel like if you wanted to kind of bring in this horror vibe, this kind of like paranormal, supernatural thing that they were kind of trying to get into there, you could have it so that these kids had actually done the things in these stories. I don't know how the noir one would work, but if they had actually done these stories, so the character, I can't even remember his name, was it Kyle or something, like the very generic all-American boy?
What, the hammer guy?
Yeah, the hammer guy.
Hammer,
If that
okay,
had if that had been an actual story, if that had actually happened, and then if that had been kept a secret and we were discovering that as everyone did, because then that would work with Anya's story where she had like the kind of dual people and they were like fighting against each other, one was good, one was bad. That, and then in order to tie that in, you could have had like the weird cult thing, had some way to like draw them to the house.
You could have even had and this like, yeah, you could have even had like, rather than Kyle or whatever his name was,
I feel like it was something very generic like that.
Yeah, if it's not Kyle, yeah, no, you are right. If it's not Kyle, it's going to be something like close to that. It's of the same like vibe as
Yeah.
Kyle. Yeah, you maybe even could have gone with like, obviously we mentioned again, can't remember his name. The kid who had AIDS.
Mm-hmm.
You could have even had like that character. Maybe he's the one telling the hammer story, and it's not so much about, it's then maybe not so much a case of like, okay, well, he's actually gone around and killed people with a hammer, but
Mm-hmm.
there's that guilt of, because he does have that fear of about people judging him, and there's that whole paranoia of AIDS, isn't there, about it spreading.
Uh-huh.
And you could have then, because the whole thing with the hammer story was, it was always women, but the idea was it was always people that you got close to, wasn't it, that you would then end up killing with the hammer. So
Mhm.
you then do have like much more of a more tangible metaphor with like,
Yeah.
this person is like sick with something that can be contagious, and they're worried about getting close to people because of like, something that was passed on to them, and there's
Mhm.
more. I feel like you could do more there that's a bit clearer, and I'm sure there is thought out meaning behind all of them. Like they do again, like there's the one where they kind of use like the story to jettison the romance between the two characters. So it's
Mhm.
there are elements of, obviously, in the time travel one, just obviously like need to change the past, and just all these like wanting to have more time and wanting to make a difference, and so like there is obviously like meaning behind all of them in their own way, but it does feel very unclear, and like you say, like the whole cult stuff as well just doesn't feel like they really mix together. It does feel like
Mhm.
they belong to two very different shows,
Yeah.
and the show kind of worked against itself, I think, because if you care more about the stories, then you're kind of annoyed every time they go back to the cultish stuff. If you care more about the cultish stuff, then you're kind of annoyed every time they go back to the stories. So you just kind of have two shows that aren't helping each other.
100%. Like, definitely agree that I feel like there definitely needed to be more of a link between the stories and the kind of main plot, because it felt like they were almost hinting at like, oh, this could be real, but then it made no sense that would be real because of the world that they had already established, where it was pretty much grounded in reality, other than Alanka's weird mishaps in the hallway. So yeah, that was pretty much I feel like the concept, like you're saying, was like a really cool idea, but it just was underutilized. I feel, pretty much like the entire show. So yeah, kind of thinking about what we were chatting about last time in terms of horror TV tropes and like how well they work as like a within the under the kind of umbrella of horror. How do you think the Midnight Club fits in? Do you think it? We kind of touched on it briefly, but do you think the elements of horror that are there make sense? That they're scary or horrifying in any way?
There's a line in there. I can't remember. I mean, like I said, there's no way I'm quoting a line verbatim from that show.
Yeah, we can't even remember the characters' names.
Yeah, exactly. But there is a really nice line about, because that is the thing. Like I'm just like giving the show a lot of flack. There are, like I did say at the start, there were things that I thought like it did. There were some really nice moments, and like there are some points that do feel like strongly written. It's the thing. It feels like something that could be a great show. It just feels like the first draft of that, and it does need like a good bit more time. But there is a line in there about like, you know, them being hard to scare because, you know, they're literally like they've all been told they're dying. They're all like that. They all are all sitting with that information all the time, and that is a really interesting perspective, and also kind of tells you why they maybe shouldn't have gone the horror route with that, because like it's like a dismissal of the horror, and obviously they do play around the whole thing of like the fact that, you know, they act like they're not afraid to die, but then they are afraid to die, and you know, as you know, as you would kind of expect from people who are dying. You know, I don't think anyone's really in a rush to. So yeah, I feel like there is definitely an interesting horror that you could make there. Again, I just feel like it's kind of a delicate thing to do, and I'm not saying you couldn't, but I just think that if it wanted to do that, then it very much should have done that, and that should have been like its priority as a show. And like I said, there are horror elements there. There's like the jump scare stuff, which kind of plays, you know, is very tongue in cheek. Then there's obviously like the creepiness about the house, and I kind of feel like it just worked against it. Like I don't think there were elements there. It felt like they were stapled on rather than like organically worked into the show. Felt like it's you know, we're gonna set it in this big creepy house, so, and you know, they meet at midnight, so we might as well have some like scary stuff going on at the same time.
Like nothing screams horror like darkness.
Exactly, and I don't think it really helped the show at all. I think it would have been a stronger show to have done without. And yeah, I think to push away from horror and to kind of like double down on the statement that, you know, what they're living with is actually way more horrible than anything we could sort of see or encounter, I think would have been the better way to go with the show, and would have been way more interesting, and you'd have mined a lot more from it. And again, you can still play up the other genre thing. I think it would have added more to the other genres and stuff that they would have done. So yeah, there was horror stuff in there, but I think it hurt the show more than anything else.
That's such a good point. I think sometimes horror really benefits. Like Hereditary is obviously a movie example, but it's a very good example of it is horror, but it's more that things in the film are horrifying. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's not that it's particularly scary in like a traditional way. No one's getting chased by someone with a knife, but it's the things that happen in it are horrifying, and I feel like that's sometimes it's at times can be a lot more interesting to watch. And like you're saying, this idea that they're young, they're kids, and that that's them. They've kind of been given their death sentence. They say throughout it, like, oh, we don't have long to live. There's one episode where the kind of nerdy guy passes his, like, the day that the doctor said he was going to die, basically. That's horrifying, especially if I feel like that'd be horrifying at any age, but especially when you were young and you haven't had any kind of experiences and anything like that. That could have been a lot more, if you had gone maybe more down a kind of the drama route, like you're saying. You could have incorporated these elements and it wouldn't feel as underdeveloped. Yeah.
But you could even just have like that sort of encroaching dread and that feeling of like, again, they do kind of touch on it, that sort of separation from the rest of the world, and the fact that they do have these ticking clocks above their head. But again, there is like really strong horror themes there. And again, you can explore that. You could explore that in a really interesting way with a horror story, but it just it just kind of felt like the show wanted to do that, but then wanted to kind of contradict that, and then wanted to and again, if it had just been a straight horror, and maybe it is these characters who are appearing to be really sort of like, maybe they isolate themselves and they're appearing to be really strong and maybe like kind of sort of better towards everyone else. You then have like these characters that have isolated themselves that are, but they and they're trying to appear strong, but then you can see that there is stuff that they're afraid of that's creeping in on the side. You have a really nice like sort of metaphorical horror there, but it kind of didn't really wanted to like put the idea on the table and then just do nothing with it.
Yeah, like there was the kind of like whole thing with Anya where she was seeing this kind of creepy horrible shadow, and it was like the implication was that it was like death and it was like coming ever closer. Like, had you just embraced that could have been so
like, that really is a bit as bleak as it gets, isn't it?
Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to point out again was kind of going in assuming it was a horror. And if you're assuming that something's a horror and then you have to watch 10 hours of it and it's not particularly scary, it's like you kind of said before, it's very like, there's a kind of like disappointed feeling where you're watching it and you're like, is this going to get scary? Like, when is that going to happen? So I feel like you're right. I feel like it should have focused more on like the kind of drama element. I feel like, I don't know whether it's suffered is not the right word, but I feel like it's maybe been hindered slightly by the creator, by the fact that it's Mike Flanagan, and he's obviously done all these really big horrors before, and he's done horror movies as well.
It does kind of feel like he's now like inextricably linked to that genre and kind of can't really get away from it. And it kind of like,
which is a shame if he wants to do other things, but at the same time, the stuff that I've seen that he's done that isn't like where he hasn't like fully embraced the horror haven't been as strong potentially, and which is a shame. But if you're good at something, just roll it at times.
The thing is, I do think he's capable of some really beautiful writing, and I think I think when I watched Bly Manor, that was the thing that kind of struck out to me by the end of it. Because it wasn't so much the horror aspects of that worked, but it does say at the end of Bly Manor that it was a love story more than that it was like a ghost story, and and I think there was some really beautiful writing there. And again, like with Midnight Club, there were some moments where it was like, okay, there's some really beautiful moments and some beautiful like stuff happening here, and that's the thing. Like I feel like he can do I feel like he's strong enough to just do like a dramatic show and not need the horror stuff attached. But I feel like that's maybe because he's now so linked to the genre, he kind of has to. He's now expected of him, because that's how he's his stuff is sold, which I think is a shame.
That is a shame.
One thing that I sort of found out the other day that I didn't realise was that I think Bly Manor, Midnight Mass, this Midnight Club, and I think the next show of his that they're doing, I think were all made within like 3 years.
Oh yeah.
Which is absolutely nuts. Like I think they've just wrapped on the last one, or maybe they wrapped a while ago on it. But I think I saw on Twitter that he basically said that they did like these 4 shows within 3 years, and obviously the pandemic's happened in there as well. So there's been like extra challenges, which does kind of make sense. Not to give the show too much grief, but it would make sense if like he was spread a little bit, because it's not like he does like an episode here and there, and then like that's kind of like his like creative involvement. He creates these shows, and then he either writes or co-writes like almost every episode, and then he directs most episodes, and to do all that within like that period is nuts. So like again, like hats off to the guy. He is considering like that workload. I think it's crazy that he is putting out quality of the kind that he is, but I would rather I mean, again, you never know how these things are like arranged. It might have been that was like, I imagine some deal made with Netflix after Hill House where they were like, please make loads and loads of shows for us. Because,
I do feel bad, because I feel like me in particular, I give it a lot of flack, but I am still a big Mike Flanagan fan. It's not like this has tainted it in any way. It's just I feel not the strongest.
Yeah.
So in terms of, obviously you were talking about writing and things, this show, I think a lot of his shows actually have, that's one of the things with horror, I suppose you could argue, is that there's a fair amount of like kind of twists and turns and whatnot, and this show had a mixed bag. So were there any for you that stood out? Any moments that you were like, oh, I didn't see that coming, or anywhere you were like, oh, that's them finally addressing that? Like we, the audience, knew that 10 hours ago.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this was one where there's more. It's more the case of like, the sort of reveals that come in, or the things that happen, and you're like, well, I guess that was going to happen eventually. I think Anya getting attacked by like death, I think happened like a bit earlier than expected, but then they kind of like walked back on that a little bit. And then like they do commit to it. They do kind of have a little bit of fun with it, but yeah, I think that one came in a bit earlier than expected, but I think that also was just like,
I feel like, sorry, like Anya in
That's
general,
fine.
like obviously spoilers, but the fact that she died pretty early on, and they very much set her up like she was, like I said, she was a big part of the show. She actually was one of the ones who had most of a personality.
yeah,
So the fact that they got rid of her so early was quite, I find that like a little bit shocking, especially like it's a weird one because there's like you're saying, there's like a second clock on top of all of them, so it's very much like which one it could it be. So
yeah.
yeah, the fact that they chose her, potentially the most entertaining one, was a bit of an odd choice.
I think yeah, I got what they were going for with it. Like it
Yeah.
very much was like, the audience will not expect this. The audience will, they will notice, or if you're going to take one of them out of the equation, you want to take one that you're going to notice the absence of, and you do want to do it in a way that does feel surprising as well, because you want to replicate that feeling of like, someone being snatched away. But yeah, it did then make it feel one, like you say, like she was like the most sort of like developed one, and it felt like there was a lot more to do and trying to explore with her character. It kind of did feel a bit like, oh, is that all we're getting from her?
Yeah.
And yeah, it did feel like the shock factor didn't feel like it was worth taking that character away.
Yeah.
I
Feel like
think,
she was an interesting character as well because she was so angry, and I feel like that would make sense that you would be angry if
yeah.
you were her, if you were that age and you found out that you were dying and there's nothing you could do about it. Like,
And even her resentment towards like Alonka, and like the fact obviously she just lost a roommate, and like she's obviously been going through this a lot, and yeah, it would be hard for her to like care about the new person that came in and get attached when you know that like either you're going or they are. And yeah, again, like there's really interesting like dramatic stuff there, but it did feel surface level a lot of the time. It did feel like, okay, she's angry because the situation, we get that's fair, but like, can we do a bit more with the
yeah.
character?
Yeah, 100%.
Um,
I think
I
there's
think.
one, oh sorry.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say the one for me that was very much not a question of did you guess, but like how quickly did you guess that, of course, the weird woman in the woods was Julia Jean. How quickly did you suss that out? The first time you saw her?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like that was just like a walking trope. That one, wasn't it? Like,
Yeah.
it was
Like,
never.
oh,
Yeah,
here's a weird woman walking the woods, the correct age for this character that you're obsessed with.
literally, yeah, obsessed with who has him. Like, it wasn't even like they'd bothered to give her, oh, and she was killed in this like fire or something. It was just like, oh, and no one really knows what happened to her. So,
Yeah.
like, I know that's like a TV show thing where you watch it and you're like, that's the character. But even in real life, if I met her, I'd be like, you probably are this person I've been obsessed with.
Yeah, 100%. And that she keeps telling Ilonka how much of a bright girl she is. I'm like, clearly not that bright. I mean, she didn't suss that. She didn't see that one coming.
Exactly. Yeah. No. Yeah, and then her obviously turning out to be like sort of evil or looking out for herself. It just, again, that also was all connected to the whole thing of like, yeah, of course that's where you're gonna go with that character.
Yeah. I feel like
Like,
as well, there was no, like, for Alonka's character, there was no, like, kind of like stranger danger warnings that were going off in her head. Like, oh, there's a creepy woman in the woods. Well, feel like in horror shows and whatnot, like, a lone woman in the woods is less creepy than a lone man in the woods.
Yeah.
But this, like, oh yeah, like, you can come and live with us, and don't bother telling anyone that you're coming to live here in this cabin in the woods.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, I just was gonna just like reiterate your point that again, like, yeah, even then, like as a horror, like it didn't even feel like it really played into the horror aspect of it that much. It kind of felt like it was being more of like a cutesy.
Yeah.
Oh, she's off having like a quirky side adventure with our like woodland friends, and
Yeah.
it just like, why? Like, if you're gonna like pretend to be a horror show, then at least have the dignity to try and make that stuff scary. But they
Yeah.
obviously didn't want to do that because they wanted to preserve the twist that you saw coming.
Yeah. That
When,
everyone, the minute I clapped eyes on her, I was like, wonder who that is.
yeah, and they maybe could have made it way more interesting if they'd actually tipped their hand on that one earlier.
Yeah.
And then you could have generated some suspense out of like what was happening there. But yeah, it just, and I guess there is that aspect as well of like when you have like a terminally ill protagonist, putting them in mortal danger, or putting them in, no, because again, it wasn't like the show was like this character's in mortal danger, but it does make you less worried
Yeah.
for like the safety of the character when they do stupid things like that. I guess because like, and just in terms of like a show, because I feel like when a character has a terminal illness, they're not just gonna die in like some flippant way, are they? Like,
Yeah.
you don't really establish that about a character to then have them go off with a stranger and then that's just like the end of it. Like you're probably gonna do a bit more there, or maybe
Yeah.
you do, but you make more of a point of like that's a mistake that they're doing.
Yeah, definitely. Another one, like, it's funny that you should mention that they should have done that earlier, because one, I feel that the timing was all wrong, and I had to Google the character's name, Dr. Stanton, when it's revealed at the end that she's part of the weird cult. She takes off her wig and she's got like that
Yeah.
tattoo at the back of her neck. That's like one of the very last shots, and I feel like that would have had a much bigger impact and would have immediately raised the stakes had that come at the end of the first episode.
Yeah,
Because-
very true actually.
Because then that would have been like, the stakes would have been risen. We would know that she's been presented as this doctor who's caring for these kids as they're dying, basically. This is their last place that they're going to be. And she's there providing that for them. And if we find out immediately that she's part of this crazy cult and things, it just would have raised the stakes. It would have been, that would have fed into the horror element more.
Yeah,
It would
it's a
have-
really
it would
good
have been
point.
like the classic villain in that sense.
Yeah, you're spot on with that. Actually, it never occurred to me, but it would have really raised the stakes in terms of the horror. It would have made it feel like, yeah, when you're seeing creepy stuff and you're seeing these kids wandering around, it would feel like, okay, maybe they're not safe. Maybe there isn't that like protector. And it even would have made the stuff more interesting when obviously you find out that maybe when the characters, you find out when the characters is like getting better, or that's how it seems, and that stuff would have been more interesting because you could have played it more of like, is she lying? Was she telling the truth?
Yeah.
I think the way they do it, when it's like an overheard phone call, I think was a bit like naff.
Yeah.
Especially, was it not like right after she's like caught them or like sitting to bed or something? So it's like,
Yeah, she knows that
why-
they're wandering about the hall, and she hasn't even closed
Yeah.
her office door.
Exactly. So yeah, you're right. That would have been way more interesting for them
Yeah.
to like throw that out in episode 1.
And I feel like even like, because they didn't really, there was some hints when like I found the notebook and stuff like that, and then she shows, it would have been more, can you imagine how much more interesting it would be if she'd found this and we knew that the doctor was part of it, and watching Alanka showing it to her to be like, oh look what I found, that would have just been, it just would have made it so much more interesting. I feel like it was such a weird, again, it just felt like almost like it cheapened it slightly. It felt very like that final kind of shot very much set it up for a second season, which leads us beautifully into our next point. Yeah, so basically I think I read somewhere that it has been renewed for a second season, and
That's it.
I think I read that somewhere, and that's odd generally for Mike Flanagan shows. His shows tend to be like one season standalone things, which I feel like work a lot better in the kind of horror trope, because there's nothing kills tension than just like over explaining it. Do you know what I mean? like the
Absolutely.
things that make horror scary is the unknown. So if you have multiple seasons of a horror show and they're all in the same kind of storyline, then it's just everything's going to be explained away. So yeah, in that kind of vein, do you think you would watch season 2?
I think I would very much wait for reviews on it, and I think that would just let that determine it. Like if it came out and it was like released to acclaim, then I'd be like, do you know what? There's enough there. There's potential there. I could see it being good, but it would have to be like, okay, they really like found their focus and they really know what they're doing with the second season. I don't think. Yeah, I think if it came out and like reviews, I genuinely would just go with reviews on this one, where I'd be like, if it got good reviews, I'd watch it. If it got middling reviews, I'd be like, nah, I'm good.
Yeah.
I did season 1. I don't need season 1 again. What about yourself?
that was pretty much like my fear going into season 2 would be that it would be the same thing rehashed again. And I feel like there's obviously a limited shelf life with the show because the characters have got a time limit basically.
Yeah.
And I feel like the first season time-wise felt like it moved quite quickly. So I don't know how much longer like they would last. Do you know what I mean?
I was surprised that there were so many of them. That was something that surprised me, was like how many of them were left standing by the end of it.
Yeah.
And I, again, it makes sense with the idea of, you know, maybe there being a season 2. I think the most interesting, just off the top of my head, I think the most interesting way for season 2 to go would be actually if it just opened with a completely new Midnight Club, and then there was maybe maybe one of the questions throughout that series was like, okay, well, what happened to the previous one? And I mean, you know, probably nothing good, but
yeah,
it would then.
That would be such an interesting way to do it, because we spoke last time about, I feel like horror works better as an anthology. So, but having that kind of link to the previous, that's such a good shout, Sam. Should get in touch with Mike and see what he's saying.
Hopefully, well, if he watches this podcast, hopefully he makes it this far through. We've given him a lot of grief.
I can't imagine he did. But yeah, that would be such an interesting, because then again, there's it sets the entire season up. You could spend the entire season figuring out what happened to the ones before. Yeah, and they're already established. I feel like part of the issue with season 1 is that they didn't really explain the kind of cult aspect of it, so I felt like I didn't know enough about it to even remotely care.
It felt like it was kind of half explained. Like it kind of felt like, again, I think that's the thing as well, because it was like they did this, oh, is it supernatural, is it not supernatural, and it always seemed to, you know, try to fall down on the side of realism and like, no, it's not actually, you know, don't be silly, of course it's not a supernatural thing. That's what you get for believing the show. But like, because it was doing that, it felt like it kind of deprived itself of like actually explaining the cult stuff, because they did kind of go that whole thing of like, well, yeah, like, you know, she thought that the ritual worked, it kind of, you know, it worked in the sense that, you know, again, the whole thing, it was just like well timed. It's just one of those like quirky things, but because of that, they just kind of leave it in the air, don't they, of like, well, they did cultish things, and like from a certain perspective it worked, but from a certain perspective it also did nothing, so it's kind of up to you whether you take it or leave it. But that's just like, why spend so much of the season making that question to then just like half answer it basically? So I feel like the second season, I feel like it would inadvertently need to spend most of the time clarifying season 1. Do you know what I mean? Like, and that's not ideal. I feel like a good season 2, there should be like questions left over from season 1, but not like the entire plot. yeah, exactly. It shouldn't be like the major questions, and it shouldn't be in that way where it's like you feel like you've had half an answer. Yeah. Like if something's left as a question, it should feel like, okay, I need to know what's happening with this. Yeah. Rather than like speculation.
Yeah, 100%. But I think I would very much err on the side of caution like you, and just wait to see what kind of other people thought about it, how well it did then, and go from there. But yeah, that wraps us up for this evening. So thank you, Sam, for joining me.
Not at all.
And
thank you.
I think it was a good choice. I'm glad I chose this one just because neither of us had seen it. And it was very fresh when we watched it, so we weren't tainted by any kind of clearly weren't tainted by anything. But yeah, no, thank you again, Sam. And obviously next time I'll be hosting again. And yeah, we'll go from there because there's no thematic link from horror to the next one, I'm afraid.
Well, I mean, was this a horror show?
True.
I know. No, I agree. I think this was a good pick. I think, like you say, I think it's interesting because we both went in, even though we didn't really have any like preconceptions, we both did go in with different perspectives on it. Obviously, you being like a massive Mike Flanagan fan, me, being aware of his work and being aware that he generally like knocks out the park. I was interested. My like confusion of premises as well. I think it was interesting to pick a show, and I think, even though I think it's interesting that we both landed in the same place ultimately with it, and that we agreed on so many points, because I was curious when I was watching it. I was like, is Catherine thinking the same, or is she having a great time with the show?
Yeah, I love that, because obviously when we're watching the shows, we make a point of not speaking to each other about the shows. So I think it is always really interesting to, and we've known each other for a while now, and there's like little bits where I'm like, I wonder, like you're saying, like, is Sam enjoying this? Like, so yeah, no, thank you for that. I think sometimes it's a bit more interesting when we don't particularly have a huge love for whatever it is we're watching. We've definitely always got a lot more to say about it.
That's true. Yeah, I think that's it. When you find fault with something, you kind of want to talk about it. Whereas like when you just kind of love something, it's almost like you kind of I guess that's part of British culture as well, as we don't really gush very well. So
that's true. Yeah.
Thank you, Mike Flanagan, for dropping the ball on this one.
Yeah, like if it was a Hill House episode, it would just have been like 10 minutes long. That'd have been us.
Yeah, exactly. It would have been like, great, cool. What else are we talking about?
Yeah, good job, Mike. But no, thank you again, Sam, and we'll wrap it up there for just now. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
See you then.
See ya. Bye.
Farewell.